In this lesson, we'll be learning how to prepare a massing model in 3D Max to visualize the building contents. What we'll be doing in this lesson is creating boxes out of that CAD geometry that we created in the last lesson. So let's go into our top view first of all and clean up our site a little bit so that we can start importing the geometry. First of all, I'm going to type Shift F to remove the framing, Shift L, Shift C to remove the lights and cameras, and then I'm going to open my layer manager just to create a new layer for the site base, which is going to be called 02 site base. And let's go and relayer that object and add it to the site base layer. We can then turn off that context so that we are only looking at our barge that we'll be building on. So next I'd like to import in the CAD geometry. So go across to import and import non-native file formats. Within your referenced files folder, you will have your lesson 16 CAD file. So double click on that. And before you click on OK, just go across to your layers tab, select none, and then just select the layers that you do want to include. And back on the geometry tab, just have a look at your incoming file units, make sure that those are correct. Once you bring it in, you'll see that everything we created in AutoCAD has now come in. And I do just want to make a note here that you could very easily go and start the entire area process by just drawing out blocks in 3D Max and then just manually typing in the length, width, and height of them. The reason why I wanted to include that AutoCAD step, even though it is a little bit redundant or not necessary, is because if you do have pre-existing AutoCAD elements, for example, a lobby that has already been drawn up from another project, perhaps a stairwell, then perhaps you want to go and take the areas just as a single outline of those elements and then bring those into 3D Max and keep them as fixed objects. So very often it's nice to work in conjunction between the two programs as you develop your building. So what we're going to do now is just trace over each of these areas. So make sure that your snaps are on, and then just click from the first to last corner and then manually input the height. I'm going to be using a temporary height of 10 meters for the outdoor area, knowing that it's not an indoor roofed space, so that can change or be just used as a bubble of space that needs to be worked with. The expo space, we can do the same thing here, and we can create a height of, let's say, 12 meters. The auditorium within the brief says it cannot be lower than 8 meters, so we'll create that 8-meter height, but I'm sure we can go much higher with that. And then for the back of house and offices, we can use a height of 4 meters, which will be the height from floor to floor. For the office, the same thing, height of 4 meters. Right, so now you can have a look. You pretty much have volumes of space that are modeled up, and here you have your site. So this furthermore allows you to see what these spaces are much better, because you can start to imagine how these blocks need to fit together. What we're going to do now, just to make this process visually a little bit easier to understand, is we're going to create 2 or 3 colored objects, and we're going to assign different colors to those objects so that we can see what we are doing a little bit easier. So I'm going to create a few V-Ray materials. This one's going to be called red plane, and the color is simply going to be red. And I'm going to create other colors such as blue plane and green plane. And all this is doing is creating a set of blocks that I'm going to work with, and I can now choose, for example, the outdoor space can be green, the expo space can be blue, and the auditorium can be red, and then we can create a gray space for the back of house and offices. So this will be called gray plane, and that can just be a desaturated medium gray. Now each of these areas, if we select the object, we can type Alt-X on our keyboard so that we can view what's inside of them. Just remember that the color won't be visible. So it's a good idea as well just to remember in your mind at least what the different colors mean. The other thing that you could do is you could take this text object and keep it together grouped within your object if you do want to create a render, perhaps for a presentation where you want to go and label the spaces. You could of course also do a render of it and label it in Photoshop afterwards. Next, what I'm going to do, instead of adding any opacity in the material, I'm just going to take these objects, right click, go to Object Properties, and drop the visibility to about 0.4. That means that when I render it, I'm going to be able to see through them slightly, and I'm not going to have to waste time adjusting any materials. Right, now what I'm going to do, next going to turn off the CAD layer for the areas, and I'm going to remember at least, or draw on the side to see what these different colors represent. And I'm going to start working with them to try and arrange things so that they fit together, and I'm just going to move them onto the site and see what the result is and how much space it takes up. So I'm going to start off first of all by just positioning these two. I'm going to take this gray space and put it underneath here. These two spaces I'm going to move up a little bit because I know that I would like to have a raised building on stilts. And I also know that this outdoor space can partially be above the building as well as below the building. So essentially, if I keep all of this open, I can have a cantilevered building, and I can have all of this space open, and I can also use some space on the roof. Then this back of house space, what we can do here is let's go and divide it in two. So I'm going to right click and go to convert to editable poly. I'm going to, instead of using the figure of 4 meters in terms of the height, I'm going to only use the bottom. I'm going to invert that selection, delete everything, and here I'm going to start cutting up this object. So I'm going to cut it up into 4 objects, right click and split those so that I can now start to create a new type of object with that same area. Now this object can be shelled up to 4 meters, which is going to give me that same volume in terms of its height. Now this object can now go and be moved onto the site. So let's go and rotate it by 90 degrees. And in plan, I'm just going to move it so that it's following these 2 areas. And if all of this is a little bit quick, don't really worry, because none of it is technically very difficult. All I'm doing is just arranging the spaces so that I can visually see the volumes of what I'm doing. So I'm moving this out the way, and basically visually I'm understanding that these back of house spaces feed, or at least are working in conjunction with these main spaces. So I'm not that worried about this outdoor space. So I'm actually going to take this entire object. I'm going to call it outdoor area. I'm going to call it areas underscore outdoor. I'm going to right click and hide that, and I'm just going to be working with these volumes here. Now if I go to my context model and I click on C and I choose my camera, I can actually start to look at that as an entire building. So what I'm going to do right now is pause the video. I'm going to do a quick render, and let's have a look at what that render looks like. And in the next lesson, we'll come back to that image with a couple of scribbles and a couple of ideas that have started to emulate out of what we have been doing in this lesson. So here is our image. It's taken 12 seconds to render, so no time wasted. And essentially what we can see is these volumes floating above our site. And very quickly we can now take this and print it out, and we can start to work with our building, knowing that when we create a little scribble, it's going to be the right size and the right shape. So what you can do as well, if you do prefer, you can convert all of these balsa textures back to white if you don't want to waste any ink printing colored textures. And the other thing I can recommend is just create a few more camera views. So for example, go to a different view. For example, a good elevation doesn't always do any harm. And have a look at what your building would look like at that elevation. Perhaps scroll back a little bit, and you can do another render of that. So again, I'm going to pause the video. Let's have a look at what this looks like, and then we'll finish the lesson with that. So there we go. That render has been done. It's another 12-second render, and we can take this image as well, print it out, and do even more scribbles and start designing our building based upon these volumes. So that pretty much is it for this lesson. All I really wanted to show you is how getting the right massing volume really helps in the beginning, and then other little tricks like splitting up your volumes into smaller shapes, knowing that you haven't changed the volume of it, or at least the square meter floor area of it. For example, this back of house area isn't a rectangle, it's now 2 long noodles. So these little tips really help. Getting this right really helps, because designing a building and then figuring out much later on in the process that nothing can fit inside of it is going to be a big time waster. So get these simple steps done right, and the whole process of modeling will become much, much faster.